The Catacombs of Paris. Hidden beneath the streets of Paris lies a vast network of tunnels and crypts, the Catacombs of Paris. Over 6 million skeletons line the walls of this eerie underground world, a small part of which is open for public tours. This is the history of how the catacombs came to be, what you can see there today, and the legends that have emerged over the years about this ghostly realm under the City of Lights. Origins in the late 18th century, the catacombs were created to solve a growing problem above ground: the city's overflowing cemeteries. Due to limited space and unsanitary conditions, Paris cemeteries had become health hazards, with decomposition smells wafting into the streets and contaminating water sources. The old stone quarries underneath the city seemed an ideal place to transfer the exhumed remains, consolidating Paris' dead underground and creating much-needed space for the living above. Beginning in 1785, night after night for decades, wagons of bones made their way through the streets in funeral processions to their new underground resting places. Skulls and femurs were neatly stacked in intricate patterns, and plaques and memorials were interspersed, paying tribute to the anonymous dead. Stretching over 300 km, today the catacombs contain just a small portion of Paris' former graveyards, yet the tiny fraction open to visitors gives just a glimpse into this hidden world of bone-lined crypts, unfinished stone chambers, and hand-carved mine decor. What you can see today. Accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase plunging 20 meters below street level, the public section of the catacombs lies beneath the left bank's Denfert-Rochereau district. Temperatures are cold year-round, hovering around 15°C-60°F. The halls are dimly lit, casting an otherworldly pall over the cavernous rooms. Gothic stone archways intersperse the skull-packed tunnels. While only 1.7 km of the catacombs are open to visitors, the route winds past fascinating historic highlights. Signs mark different zones along the way, like the area created after Paris' Great Cemetery closures, and sections carved directly through solid limestone. Sculptures decorate crypt walls, from carvings of castles and saints to abstract symbols. And audio commentary tells stories from Paris history, like the 1774 Beast of Gavaudan attacks. One chamber even served as a secret meeting room for the French resistance during the occupation, as evidenced by various markings on the walls. And a small chamber was converted into a memorial for those resistance members tortured or killed during the liberation of Paris in 1944. A plaque commemorates them as martyrs for the cause of French freedom. The exit staircase leads up to street level near the iconic Montparnasse Tower skyscraper. In just an hour, underground, visitors walk away with lasting memories of Paris' past buried beneath their feet. Legends and mysteries. For all the catacomb mysteries solved, many more endure. The vast majority remain completely unexplored, the domains of cataphiles, urban explorers illegally accessing off-limits tunnels. Reports have surfaced over the years of everything from secret crypt raves to bands performing guerrilla gigs under the city streets. Various police operations have tried to crack down over the decades, though intrepid urban adventurers continue accessing forgotten spaces. Some cataphile discoveries have made news headlines, from prehistoric cave paintings to remnants of World War II bomb shelters, to abandoned film sets. Hidden chambers litter the tunnels, untouched for decades or centuries. The catacombs' vast scale leaves seemingly infinite secrets still to uncover. Beyond the bounds of physical space, a whole set of ghost stories and supernatural legends have arisen around the Paris catacombs. With a cemetery's worth of human remains encased in every tunnel wall, tales range from haunted spirits to demonic entities and unnameable beasts that prowl the forgotten corridors. Some report hearing faint whispers in deserted galleries, seeing fleeting specters wandering side passages, or smelling invisible funeral flower wreaths floating through the darkness. Others speak of ominous cold spots, disembodied screams, or the sense of being watched by malicious non-human presences. A few claim 20th century satanic covens performed dark rituals in remote caverns in decades past. And recent legends tell of subterranean cults, like the so-called Underworld Society, still meeting secretly in the tunnels today. For all the endless halls of neatly lined femurs and tibias, the catacombs hide their share of mysteries. While paranormal encounters are not guaranteed, ghost hunters and supernatural enthusiasts flock here, seeking contact with lingering souls of Paris past, buried in the bone-filled tunnels. Just don't wander off alone into the darkness. You never know what you may stumble across. Buried beneath the city of lights, streets. The creation of the catacombs. The catacombs emerged as the solution to a growing problem in Paris, the city's overcrowded cemeteries. By the late 18th century, Parisians were buried in overcrowded mass graves, church graveyards, and small urban plots. The living quarters literally bordered the realms of the dead, and the graves were not exactly restful places. Instead, Paris burial grounds had turned into heaving hotbeds of decomposition and contamination. Heavy seasonal flooding left human remains unearthed and floating in cesspool like surface water. Even without flooding, the shallow graves led fluids to leak into wells and city water reserves. The smell permeated neighborhoods, blowing open windows. Public health suffered amid spreading bacteria, germs, and heavy metals leaching from the decomposing bodies. Church and city officials searched for solutions as the living and dead space collided. Various proposals suggested moving graves outside city limits or even banning burials inside Paris altogether. But it was ultimately the old quarry and mine network winding beneath the streets that offered the ideal body disposal solution. These abandoned caverns and tunnels stretched over 300 kilometers in intricate labyrinths 20 and 30 meters below the surface. Cold year-round and carved from solid limestone, they promised both ample space and sealed off isolation from city life and water supplies. It was in these forgotten quarries that the catacombs slowly took shape, emptying overcrowded cemeteries into the void beneath Parisians' feet. The exhumation and transfer of remains into the catacombs began shortly before the French Revolution, in 1785. As parish graveyards and mass graves were methodically emptied, nightly processions of black, draped wagons transported exhumed bones through Paris streets to their new underground resting places. There was likely no shortage of disease, danger, and disgust involved in this mammoth, decade-spanning operation. Yet for city officials, the catacombs promised a place to finally consolidate Paris' ad hoc boneyards and resolve the public health hazard of overflowing cemeteries. For decades, the emptied remains of generations were reinterred together, identifiable only by the cemeteries or churchyards they came from. Nameless bones were carefully organized into elaborate geometric displays. While memorial plaques paid tribute to this anonymous collective dead, little did city planners know these disused quarry tunnels would one day become an eerie underground ossuary and one of Paris' most fascinating macabre landmarks. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, the catacombs continued evolving with forbidden raves, police crackdowns, accidental drownings, ghost stories, and all manner of legends, bringing cold case mysteries to the maze of crypts. Today, a tiny portion of the tunnels offer a public glimpse into Paris' past, buried beneath the streets. But endless chambers remain completely uncharted, home for almost 2 centuries now to the consolidated bones of Paris dead. The growth of Paris' cemetery problem. It was the very geography and dense design that made Paris so prone to the cemetery overcrowding crisis. By the late 1700s, the city center was hemmed in by both river and wall, with little room for expansion. Yet the population continued growing rapidly inside these cramped confines. The city had grown up organically over the centuries, with winding alleys following old cow paths and no systematic urban planning. Districts were cramped warrens of densely packed buildings with little consideration given to functional spacing or public health. The city center in particular remained tightly constricted, its borders long since exceeded by its living population. Yet while Paris packed in the newly arrived living, no mass exodus of the long dead followed. The urban space may have been busting at the seams, but parish churchyards and urban graveyards were still accumulating generation upon generation of dead citizens. Bodies were traditionally buried directly under and around their associated churches and chapels. As the city's worship spaces multiplied from the Middle Ages onward, so too did their adjoining cemeteries. District burial grounds likewise swelled amid the population boom, quickly exceeding capacity as well. These urban graveyards were so modest in size that plots commonly stacked 8 corpses vertically before being reused. And the situation only worsened once medieval mass graves were added to the mix. The plague and other epidemics left hundreds of thousands of Parisians hastily buried in these communal pits. They were scattered around churches, public squares, and charity hospital grounds. When later building construction uncovered them, bones were just haphazardly reburied elsewhere. The space for Paris dead had clearly passed any sustainable threshold as the 18th century wore on, and the unsanitary conditions created by overcrowded, shallow graves worsened every year. The unmarked plague pits in particular held dangers of lingering contamination. Something had to give as the balance tipped between the city's living and deceased residents. The Catacombs plan was devised just in time to alleviate an impending public health disaster by keeping Paris' long-accumulated dead buried away from its growing communities of living. The quarries beneath Paris. Carving the future catacomb space required no excavation equipment or structural engineering. Paris already had hundreds of kilometers of tunnels conveniently lying vacant right below its streets. Dating back to Roman times or earlier, a vast quarry network stretched beneath whole swaths of the city. The Romans prized the limestone deposits lying just under Paris topsoil, using them to construct their Lutetia settlement and its associated structures. Remains of Roman baths, aqueducts, temples, walls, and homes attest to large-scale quarrying activity in the city center centuries before the first French kings ruled here. Once Paris emerged as an important medieval trade center, fresh limestone construction projects accelerated the need from churches and bridges to the Louvre Palace and Notre Dame Cathedral. With tunnels stretching over 60 meters down in places, quarry digging was increasing, literal unearthing on an immense subterranean scale. This intensive limestone extraction honeycombed a matrix of tunnels and caverns beneath Paris streets for over a millennium. But it was a dangerous, unglamorous profession, done largely by night. There were regular tunnel collapses and accidental burials of unsuspecting surface buildings. The unstable caverns posed threats both above and below ground. Quarrying underneath central Paris neighborhoods was finally banned in the 1700s for public safety reasons. By then, tunnels stretched an estimated 300 kilometers, leaving vast abandoned spaces threading and crisscrossing under most central quarters. No accurate maps documented the meandering maze of played-out passageways. It was in these dark, forgotten labyrinths of left-bank limestone mines that the catacombs eventually arose. The disused Roman-era quarries seemed almost custom, designed to house Paris' overcrowded remains. In fact, temporary cemeteries even arose in former mine tunnels as early as the 13th century, perhaps inspiration for the eventual ossuary solution taking shape far below Paris streets. Laying the dead to rest underground. Given the extremely confined nature of Paris' historic center, no practical sites remained for new cemeteries by the mid-1700s. Yet nearly every church still maintained its traditional graveyard, no matter how cramped and unsanitary conditions became. Burying the dead was simply part of their ongoing operations. Certain sacred spaces, like St. Innocent's Cemetery, had become downright notorious for their ghoulish conditions. Yet they continued operating through the late 1700s, perpetually overfilled and leaking human remains into neighboring basements and water supplies. Attempts to layer new graves over buried ones only worsened the tightly packed mess. Police reports logged neighbors frequently complaining of intolerable smells or frightening discoveries of skeletal parts poking through walls or floating down flooded streets. It had become all too clear that these overflowing graveyards posed both a health hazard and public safety threat. After centuries of continuous burials, the subterranean limestone quarries were proposed as the solution in 1763, safely relocating remains to permanent underground ossuaries carved through solid rock. Church cemeteries and common graves could then be closed to new burials. It was quickly decided to proceed with digging entrance shafts down to mine levels and carving out designated bone repository spaces. The exhumations and transfer of remains into quarry tunnels then commenced in 1785. The operation to empty Paris cemeteries and house their occupants under the streets was no small task. For decades it required methodically exhuming millions of skeletons and fragments by lamplight, then reinterring them deep underground. The repetitive rounds of clearing graveyards plot by plot and making nightly bone deliveries continued through the chaos of the French Revolution and successive Paris governments. Records show that by 1814, the remains of some 6 million Parisians had been moved to the disused quarries and the emptied cemeteries permanently closed. Above ground, Stack upon stack of bones was laid out in carefully orchestrated designs across available wall and floor space. It mirrored the compact mass burials scaling vertically due to intense space constraints in Paris graveyards. Limestone pillars divided the remains by their original cemetery into tight galleries heaped with bones. Memorial tablets noted each church or cemetery of origins. Here at last, generations of Parisians could repose together in these stony underground crypts, separate from the concerns of the living city. Cool year-round and ventilated by close-lying air shafts, the ossified quarries promised a viable interment solution that graveyards could no longer provide. Over 19th and 20th century decades, sporadic expansions and elaborations continued in the miles of illegal offshoot tunnels. Skulls were arranged into hearts, crosses, and even anchor shapes spotted by unauthorized visitors. As Paris graveyards filled again, reinforcements were added to the catacombs like bones from the former monastery of the Val de Gris hospital. Today, the tiny, legally accessible portion of this Paris underworld offers only the slightest glimpse into the unseen catacombs. Rows of skulls stretch to the horizon, interspersed with signs marking zones allotted to different cemeteries, remains. Yet 90% of tunnels remain uncharted, the unbeatable terrain of urban explorers and cataphiles seeking adventure in this modern cataclysm. Curiosities among the bones. While quarry spaces were pragmatically converted into makeshift mausoleums, later visitors brought a more creative flair. The catacombs galleries gradually accumulated various decorations and memorials, added over the last 2 centuries, dotting bone-packed tunnels with unexpected treasures. From carvings and sculptures to secret wartime sites, strange stories hide around many corners. One chamber even hosted part of the French resistance movement during Nazi occupation in Wei. Thanks to their relative isolation and labyrinth layouts, sections of unused tunnels offered discreet meeting points. Starting around 1941, some areas were outfitted as temporary shelters and hideaways for resistance members seeking refuge or planning activities against German forces. Known as the Ursofleaks, one such resistance movement left its literal mark on the walls here. Carved inscriptions date activities to around 1944 near the exit site close to central Paris. Graffiti includes patriotic symbols, coded enemy munitions train schedules, meeting dates, and logistical notes. These scribbles stand as haunting reminders of covert freedom fighters gathered below while war raged in the streets overhead. Other hidden messages come from so-called cataphiles, who made their own marks decades later. These urban explorers sneak illegally into off-limits catacomb sections via secret entrances and manholes. Just getting to these unofficial tunnels is an adventure requiring navigation of tiny crawl spaces, rickety ladders, and unsafe stonework. Yet cataphiles prize access to forgotten catacomb spaces barred to the public. Left undisturbed for ages, these halls hide stunning quarry carvings, wartime ruins, even rare cave salamanders. In one hidden chamber, 20th century cataphiles carved an illicit underground nightclub dubbed Le Palais. Complete with bar, cinema, seating, and dance floor, it hosted rowdy invitation-only gatherings before police dismantled it. Such secret chambers testify to just how vast and sprawling the unfinished caverns are. Cataphiles keep probing deeper through dusty stone layers untouched for centuries or longer. The catacombs hide their share of mysteries and curiosities, with endless more still unrevealed. The public catacombs today. A tiny peek into this endlessly twisting ossuary maze is made possible via the public catacombs entry and tour route. An inconspicuous hut in front of a Montparnasse railway terminal hides the stone spiral staircase entryway deep below street level. After a 20-meter descent, visitors find themselves before a dark portal surrounded by skulls and crossbones. It opens onto 1.7 kilometers of passages snaking through musty bone vaults, alcoves, and carved limestone support pillars. Rough tunnels were left largely unfinished, requiring visitors to watch their footing on uneven ground. The lack of natural light or ventilation highlights the immense pressure. Sitting tons of stone and Paris itself exert over these subterranean spaces. Yet while only a small fraction of underground chambers is accessible, it offers a self-guided walk through rich history otherwise forgotten beneath the hustle of Paris. Displays trace the tunnel system's creation from quarry days through its current incarnation. Housing remains from across the city. Cavern after cavern unfolds, adorned with carefully stacked bones exhumed from Parisian graveyards long since gone. Above ground, rows of skulls peer through eye sockets in an eerie reminder of mortality. And the city's incredibly compacted past buried layer upon layer. Signs mark zones dedicated to major cemetery sites like Saint-Gervais and the Cimetière.